You built the account. You watched the number go up for 30 years. And now the number is there, and you still can't bring yourself to spend it. Not because you can't afford to, but because not spending it has started to feel more like yourself than spending it would. That is not a financial problem. That is something older than money. I've watched it happen in my neighbor Phil, who spent 4 years asking his wife's permission to buy a fishing rod. Not for the money, because the habit was that deep. I watched it happen in a man I know who has been 1 year away from a trip he wants to take for the last 3 years. I watched it happen to myself on a Saturday morning in the garage, running the numbers on a part I already knew I could afford, because that's just what I do. That's just who I am. I'm Mike Decker. I spent 36 years keeping industrial machinery running in Rockford, Illinois, and I've been watching myself and the men I know navigate this specific unnamed thing for 2 years now. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm a witness. If you're somewhere in that same passage, subscribe and hit the bell. Every person here is proof that someone is taking this stage of life seriously. And before we go any further, I want to ask you something. What is the specific moment from your working years that you told yourself you were saving toward? The thing you said later to? Write it in the comments. I want to know what's been waiting. Hear what comes next with an open mind. You spent 35 years not spending it. So why does spending it feel like you're doing something wrong? When's the last time you bought something with that money? Not a bill, not a repair, something you actually wanted and didn't feel like you had to justify it to yourself. When did saving stop being a plan and start being just who you are? And here's the one that's been sitting with me since last October. If you die with a full account, what exactly did you save it for? I want you to sit with those questions for a minute. Don't answer them yet. Just let them be there. It was a Saturday morning last fall. Karen was at her sister's for the weekend. I was out in the garage with the Mustang, and I'd gotten to a point where I needed to order a part. Not a cheap part, not an expensive part for what it is, just a part. And I caught myself doing the thing. You know the thing. Running the number. Not because the number was a problem. I've been retired 2 years. I know what the account looks like. I know what we spend. The number wasn't close to being a problem. I was running it anyway, the way you'd check a gauge that you already know is fine, just to check it, just because that's what you do. And I sat there on the stool for a minute and I thought, what exactly am I waiting for? I ordered the part. Took about 30 seconds. But that minute on the stool, that's the minute I keep coming back to. I've been thinking about this for months now. Not the part, not even the money specifically. The habit, the reflex, the 35 years of muscle memory that says, check the number, hesitate, justify, then maybe. The thing that was a tool for 3.5 decades and somewhere in the transition stopped being a tool and became just who I am. How many of you know exactly what I'm talking about? How many of you have stood in a store or been on a website or been sitting across from your wife at dinner talking about a trip you both want to take and felt that thing? That low-grade internal audit that says, do you really need this? Can you justify it? What if something comes up? How many of you have answered those questions honestly and still said no? Not because you couldn't afford it, but because not spending it felt more like yourself than spending it. I'm 62 years old. I spent 36 years in manufacturing maintenance, watching budgets, making equipment last, fixing things instead of replacing them, getting 1 more year out of a machine that another crew would have junked. That was the job. That was what I was good at. That value system. Don't waste. Don't spend what you don't have to. Make it last. That wasn't just a work habit. That was my father's voice in my head, and his father's voice, and the whole working class tradition of men who knew that money was finite and you'd better act like it. I'm not saying that tradition was wrong. It got me here. It put 3 kids through school. It kept a roof on the same house for 22 years. It built the account that's sitting there right now being very carefully not spent. What I am saying is this. I built that discipline to get to retirement. And now I'm in retirement and the discipline is still running the show. And I'm starting to wonder if that's wisdom or if that's just fear wearing a different coat. There's a difference between those two things. It took me a while to see it. My neighbor Phil, retired electrician, been out 3 years longer than me, which makes him the most useful person I know right now because he's already made the mistakes I'm about to make. Phil told me something last fall that I've been thinking about ever since. He said he'd been retired 4 years when his wife finally sat him down and said something that stopped him cold. Phil had been asking her about purchases, not big purchases, not they need to sit down and talk purchases. He was asking her about a fishing rod he'd been looking at for 2 years, that cost less than a decent dinner out, that was not by any reasonable measure a financial decision. And he was asking her about it, not because he needed her permission, but because after 4 years of retirement, the habit of justification was still so deep that he didn't know how to skip the step. She said to him, "Phil, you worked 37 years so you could buy yourself a fishing rod. Buy the fishing rod." He told me he stood there in the kitchen for a moment and genuinely didn't know what to do with that. He bought the rod. He's used it probably 40 times since. He told me he thinks about that conversation every time he goes out. What Phil's wife named in that kitchen was something most of us never hear put that directly. She wasn't talking about the rod. She was talking about the fact that Phil had spent almost 4 years in retirement, still operating like the accumulation phase wasn't over, still protecting the account like the account was the goal, still treating every purchase as a small test of character rather than as the use of something that was built for that exact purpose. The accumulation phase is over. I want to say that again because I don't think most of us have really heard it. The accumulation phase is over. What comes next is supposed to be different. Not reckless, not irresponsible, different. The account you spent decades building was not the trophy, it was the fuel. And fuel that sits unused in a tank doesn't become more valuable with time. I know that's not how it feels. It feels like the responsible thing to do is keep it, protect it, leave it there as evidence that you lived carefully and did the right things. And maybe some of it does get left behind, for the kids, for medical costs that might come, for the years when you can't do as much and need more. I understand all of that. I'm not talking about being reckless. I am not a financial advisor, and I'm not giving you financial advice. What I am saying, from 2 years of watching myself and Phil and a few other men I know who are in this same passage, is that there is a specific and recognizable fear that lives underneath the not spending. And it is not the fear of running out. It's older than that. It's the fear of being the kind of person who spends money on himself. The fear of being your own father's definition of irresponsible. The fear that if you stop protecting the account, you stop being the person who protected it, and that person was someone you were proud of. That is the thing I think nobody talks about, not the math, the identity. Let me tell you about my father-in-law. Karen's father worked in a printing plant for 31 years. Good man, careful man. He and his wife raised 4 kids on one income in a house that was always clean and always tight. He retired at 63 with a pension and savings that he had built slowly over 3 decades of not wasting anything. He lived to 81, 18 years of retirement. For those 18 years, he and Karen's mother lived on about $700 a month of their own money. Not because they had to, because that's who he was. They took one trip to visit a cousin in Florida in all of that time. They ate at home. They drove the same car for 11 years. He fixed things instead of replacing them, just like I did at the plant, except he was doing it with the house while he was retired. He died with more in the account than he'd ever spent in a year. Karen doesn't talk about this much. When she does, she's careful with her words. She doesn't say he was wrong to save. She doesn't say he should have spent more. What she says is that she's not sure whether he was at peace or whether the habit of protection had just become indistinguishable from peace. She's not sure he knew the difference by the end. She's not sure he ever let himself find out. I think about that when I'm in the garage. I think about it more than I probably should. There's a particular kind of man, and I've known several of them, you probably have too, for whom the not spending became its own source of identity and satisfaction. The account balance was proof of something. Not wealth exactly, more like correctness, more like evidence that they had lived rightly, not been foolish, done the thing you were supposed to do. For that man, spending the money isn't about the thing he'd be buying. It's about losing a way of measuring himself that he's held on to for 40 years. I understand that man. I was closer to being that man than I was comfortable admitting. Here's what changed my thinking, or started to change it. Not a book, not a conversation specifically, not a thing someone said to me that flipped a switch. It was a slower thing than that. About 8 months into retirement, I was at the Votech. I volunteer one morning a week at the high school here, teaching basic mechanical and electrical troubleshooting to kids going into the trades. Juniors and seniors, 17 and 18 years old, heading into HVAC and manufacturing and electrical work. Good kids, sharp kids. I was talking to a group of them one morning about careers, which they'd asked about, and I was telling them something honest about what 40 years in the trades looks like from the inside. And without really planning to say it, I said, "The money you're going to make over a career, you're going to spend 30 years being afraid to spend." They looked at me like I'd said something in the wrong language. One kid, name is Marcus, headed into electrical, sharp as anyone I've taught. He said, "Why would you be afraid to spend money you earned?" I didn't have a good answer. Not one I could say in a high school classroom anyway. Because the honest answer is, because you spent so long being afraid not to have it, that the fear became structural. Because the discipline that protected you on the way up doesn't automatically release when you get there. Because nobody hands you a document at retirement that says, "You've done the hard part, you can let go of this now." Marcus is going to make good money someday. He's going to save carefully for 30 years the way his parents probably told him to, the way his culture will reinforce, the way every message from every financial institution will push him toward. And somewhere in his early 60s, if he's lucky enough to get there with the account intact, he is going to be sitting on a stool in a garage somewhere, running the number on something he wants to buy. And I hope he buys the thing faster than I did, because here's what I have slowly come to understand. The account is not the monument. The account is not the proof that you lived right. The account is not what your father was trying to teach you, even if it looked like that from the outside. What your father was trying to teach you, what my father was trying to teach me, was that you don't end up desperate. You don't end up at the mercy of other people's charity. You don't run out before you're done. But running out before you're done and dying with everything intact are not the same thing. They're opposite problems, and only one of them gets talked about. The fear of running out gets discussed constantly. There are entire industries built around it. Magazines, seminars, advisors. Every piece of retirement content you've ever seen is organized at some level around the fear of not having enough. Nobody talks about the other fear. The fear of having enough and not using it. The fear of being the man who worked his whole life for something and then didn't let himself have it. I want to talk about that fear because I think it's more common than anyone says, and I think it does more damage than anyone admits. 2 years in, I've had conversations with more retired men than I expected to have. Some of them through this channel, some of them through Phil, some of them at the Votech or the hardware store, or just around the neighborhood. Men who are 2, 3, 5, 8 years into retirement. And what I hear, over and over, in different words with different specifics, is some version of the same thing. I know the money is there. I know we're okay. But I can't stop acting like we're not. One man I know, I'm not going to use his name, has been retired 6 years. His wife has been after him for 2 years to take a trip they both want to take. Not an expensive trip in any objective sense. A trip they can genuinely afford without any complicated planning. And every time they get close to booking it, he finds a reason to wait. The timing isn't right. There's something going on with the car, maybe next year. His wife told me she's starting to wonder if the trip is going to happen while they're both healthy enough to enjoy it. She didn't say this bitterly. She said it the way you'd observe the weather. That's the cost of the habit that doesn't turn off. Not the money, the trip, the thing they both want. The years they're spending in the waiting room of their own retirement, and they're already in it. Here's the thing I want you to sit with. At some point in your working life, early on probably, you made a decision. Maybe you made it consciously. Maybe you just absorbed it from the men around you who lived it. But you made a decision. I am going to be the kind of person who doesn't waste, who doesn't spend carelessly, who builds something, who protects what he's built. That decision shaped your whole working life. It probably shaped it well. It got you to a retirement that is, by the measures that count, secure. You made sacrifices for it. You said no to things. You drove the car another year. You fixed it instead of replacing it. You watched the number go up. You held that position for 30 or 40 years. The account doesn't know what you gave up to build it. You do. You know the vacations you didn't take, the things you told yourself later, the years you spent at the plant or on the job site or behind the wheel of the truck when you could feel that the clock was running and you told yourself it was fine, it was the plan, this is what you do. The account doesn't hold any of that. The account is just a number. And I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to sit with it before you answer it. What are you waiting for? Not the planning question. I know you've done the planning or you're doing it. I mean the human question. The specific thing you want to do, or the place you want to go, or the project you want to start, or the version of your days that you've been telling yourself you'll get to when the time is right. What is it? Can you name it? Can you say it out loud, even just to yourself, in the garage or wherever you're watching this? Because I think most of us can name it. I think the thing is there. I think it's been there for a while. I think the habit of waiting is what's keeping us from it, not the money, the habit. I'm not asking you to throw out the discipline that got you here. I'm asking you to ask yourself whether the discipline is still in service of something real, or whether it's just running on its own power now, like a machine that keeps going after the job is done. There's a difference between protecting yourself and shrinking yourself, a real difference, and it matters. And I think a lot of good, careful, responsible men end up on the wrong side of that line without ever making a decision to get there. They just kept doing the thing that worked, past the point where it needed to keep working, because nobody told them they were allowed to stop. So here is what I want to say to you, as plainly as I can say it. You are allowed to stop. Not to stop being careful, not to stop thinking, but to stop treating every purchase as a small referendum on your character, to stop running the number on the thing that is clearly fine, to stop living in the accumulation phase of a life that is now in a different phase. You earn the right to use what you built, not as a reward. That framing is wrong. It turns spending into a prize for good behavior, as the actual point, as the thing the plan was for, as the answer to the question you've been too scared to ask yourself directly. What was all of this for? I want to suggest something before I close. Not a financial strategy, not a plan. Something simpler than that. There's something you've been putting off. I'm going to guess you know exactly what it is. You don't need to tell me what it is. But I want you to think about it right now, in whatever room or garage or chair you're watching this from. Not the cost of it, the thing itself. The trip, the project, the experience, the version of your life that you've been 1 year away from for longer than 1 year. Just hold it for a minute. Let it be specific. Let it be real. Now I want to ask you to do something small. Not today necessarily. This week. Write it down. Not the plan for it, just the thing. 1 sentence or less. And then I want you to ask yourself honestly, what exactly am I waiting for? And when you have your answer, I want you to ask whether that answer is still true. I think for a lot of us, the honest answer to what we're waiting for is nothing in particular. We're waiting because waiting is what we know. Because the discipline of waiting served us so well for so long that it became invisible, became just how we move through the world. The season for that discipline is behind you. The season for using what you built is the one you're in. I'm going to ask you to sit with this for a minute before you go anywhere. Before you scroll, before you comment, before you hit subscribe, before you do the next thing. Take a minute. Think about the thing you wrote down or should write down. Think about Phil and the fishing rod. Think about what it would mean to live the next 10 years from a different premise than the one that built the account. That's what I want to leave with you today. Not an answer, a question worth sitting with. When you've had a minute, I'd genuinely like to know, what have you been putting off? Not the reason, I think we both know the reason, the thing, the trip, the project, the whatever it is. Write it in the comments. I read every one of them. And more than once, a comment down there has said something that made me think harder about what I'm doing with my own time. So I'm not asking for the numbers. I'm asking for the thing. If what you heard today connected with something you've been carrying around, I'd be glad to have you subscribe. Hit the bell too if you're willing. Not because the numbers matter to me, but because the conversations in the comments on this channel have become some of the most honest ones I have. Working men talking honestly about what this passage actually looks and feels like. That's what this is for. Take the minute. The fishing rod's been in the store long enough.